Good afternoon and welcome to our discussion of Chapter 8. So Chapter 8 looks at culture and communication, and we're just going to highlight a few important takeaways here. Remember, culture is an ongoing negotiation of how our learned patterns of beliefs, attitudes, values, and behaviors. And some important things to recognize from this is that while there are some aspects of our culture that are very ingrained, there are some parts of that change over time as we interact with more people, as we have different life experiences, things that identify and guide our beliefs, attitudes, values, and behaviors can change. There are three components to our cultural identity. The first is personal, and so that is things that are connected to our interests and life experiences. So if it's things like you identify as somebody who is an avid gardener, or you really like being around pets, those sorts of things are part of your identity that are very personal. The second is that there are very social aspects, which is how we connect to meaningful social groups. So if I were to say, if you ask me who I am, and one of the ways that I answer that is, oh, I'm a member of this church, that's an example of a very social connection that I use to explain who I am. People will also say things like, oh, I was in Boy Scouts or I was in Girl Scouts. Those sorts of social connections are identifying who we are based on some groups that we are a part of. The third one are cultural identities, which are more based on socially constructed categories that have certain behavior expectations. So people may say, oh, I'm a Texan or I'm an Oklahoman, and they will explain and distinguish themselves in that ways. They can explain who they are, their cultural identity, by their religious background. So a lot of times in introduction speeches, when I ask students to tell us a little bit about who they identify their religion. So they'll say, I am a Christian, or those sorts of things that are there that identify them. And there are behavioral expectations for certain groups. If you look at any time voting demographics are broken down, there are reports on this is how women will vote, or this is how men will vote, or this is what the Latino vote looks like. So we have certain expectations based on cultural identities. One of the things that Chapter 8 talks about is how we form our identities are different depending on if it's a dominant identity formation or non-dominant identity formation, and that's important for you to go back and review. And then remember that difference matters, and how we talk to people and interact with people that are different than us is important. It's important for us to recognize that so that we can communicate who we are, and how we communicate that can be effective. Some specific cultural identities that Chapter 2 talks about are things like race, gender, sexuality, and ability. And those are all socially constructed identities that have a rich history. The second section of Chapter 8 spends a whole lot of time talking about those. So how race has influenced things over time, how gender and disability and ability, all of those things have become important. So there are some interesting conversations in your textbook there. And then the last two sections of Chapter 3 or Chapter 8 talk about intercultural communication and intercultural competence. So remember, intercultural communication is simply communication between people with different cultural identities. It's important to realize that not everybody has the same cultural identity that we do, and so we may communicate about those things in different ways. One of the things that we need to be aware of is to avoid ethnocentrism, which is just the belief that your culture or background is superior to other cultures and backgrounds. And typically when we think of ethnocentrism, we think of very bad examples of where people had very bad intent. So usually when we think of ethnocentrism, we think of people like Hitler, who try to eliminate entire race. We think about hate groups like the KKK. Those are obviously examples of ethnocentric groups or people who have very, very bad goals. However, there are times where we can communicate in ethnocentric ways and not be aware of it. So for example, in the United States, we have Gerber baby food, and on the Gerber baby food are pictures of really cute little babies. And when Gerber Baby Food first marketed that food in China, they didn't do enough background or cultural research about it. And what is on the container in China is what is in the container. And so when they mass produced and marketed tons of Gerber Baby Food with cute little babies on the outside, it did not go over well. It wasn't intended to be ethnocentric or not looking at culture, but it was. Same thing, another example of that is that in the past, when the United States used to send food aid to other countries, we would see food aid that met the dietary needs of people in the United States. Once looking at that policy, we made changes several decades ago to send food aid that meets the dietary needs of people in that culture. So it went from an ethnocentric policy to a non-ethnocentric policy that's there. So it can be unintentional, and we need to look at how we communicate about culture to identify, you know, are we showing some bias? Is there some ethnocentrism there that maybe I'm not aware of? The next thing chapter 8 talks about are some dialectical approaches to communication. I would really encourage you to spend some time looking at that in chapter 3. Dialectics talks about how there are struggling components of our identity and our culture. So for example, I may be partly very individualistic, but I'm also a part of a community. And so there's a struggle there determining which side is going to win and how we make concessions on those things. In intercultural relationships, people face challenges in negotiating things that we have similar and difference. And so that's something that's really important to look at. And then finally, remember, our goal is to develop intercultural communication competence, which just means that we learn and build skills that give us the ability to communicate effectively and appropriately in various cultural contexts. So how we communicate, what we talk about, all of those things are very culturally bound. And so the more we're aware of those cultural differences, the more we can communicate effectively. If you have any questions about chapter 8, please don't hesitate to let me know. Thanks.